Keep watching the story and follow Mr. Marcus Stories for more powerful moments.
Denise Calloway ripped the check into 4 pieces before Marcus Bennett could even reach for it back, and she did it slowly, deliberately, the way a person tears something they want you to watch them destroy. His daughter Zoe, 8 years old, in a purple raincoat, 2 sizes too big because it had been her cousin's first, stood pressed against his hip and watched every piece flutter down onto the tile like the ending of something she did not yet have the words for. "People like you don't walk into my branch with $6 million, Denise said, loud enough that 3 tellers and a line of 9 customers heard every syllable of it. Marcus did not raise his voice. He looked at her the way a man looks at a storm he has already decided not to run from, and he told her evenly that she had just made the single most expensive mistake of her career. Before we get into how a Tuesday morning turned into the biggest scandal Ridgeline National Bank had seen in 11 years, if stories about people being underestimated get under your skin the way they get under mine, go ahead and hit subscribe, because this one earns it. Marcus Bennett was 43 years old, and for 6 years he had been the only parent Zoe had ever really needed. His wife had left before Zoe's 3rd birthday, chasing a version of her life that did not include diapers or dance recitals, and Marcus had simply absorbed the space she left behind the way water fills a container without complaint. He lived in a rented duplex on Larkspur Avenue in the town of Millbrook, 20 minutes outside Charlotte, North Carolina, in a neighborhood where nobody looked twice at his gray 2011 Honda Accord with the cracked side mirror, or the navy work jacket he had owned since Zoe was in diapers. He drove her to school every morning at 7:20 sharp. He made dinner every night, usually something simple, and he had never once missed a single recital. Not even the year his firm closed its largest fund on the same afternoon, Zoe played a tambourine in her school's spring concert. Nobody at Lincoln Elementary knew that the quiet man in the faded jacket had built Bennett Meridian Group from a single laptop in a rented office above a dry cleaner into a firm that managed close to $4 billion in assets. Marcus had made sure of that. He did not want his daughter believing that a person's worth could be measured by the stitching in his coat, or that money was something you wore instead of something you used. He still drove the Accord. He still wore the same sky brown leather watch he had bought secondhand the year Bennett Meridian posted its first profitable quarter, and his success sat quietly behind an ordinary life, visible only to the small circle of people who actually needed to know it was there. That Tuesday morning at 10:47, a check for $6,214,908 had cleared into his hands, the proceeds of an early stake he had taken in a logistics software company most people had never heard of until its stock tripled overnight. Marcus already knew exactly where the money was headed. Half would go into a trust for Zoe, sealed until she was old enough to understand what patience actually bought a person. The other half was meant to seed something he had been quietly building for 2 years, a scholarship fund for children being raised by a single mother or a single father, the kind of household he understood in his bones because he had lived every exhausted, proud, sleepless version of it. He brought Zoe along because they had a whole afternoon planned, one she had been narrating since breakfast in the specific, breathless way only an 8-year-old can narrate a Tuesday. First the bank, then the bookstore on Ashcroft Street, where he had promised her 3 books instead of the usual one, because Bennett Meridian's fund had closed and he was, for once, in an easy mood. Then dinner at the diner she liked near the old train depot, the one with the milkshakes that came in the tall glasses. It was supposed to be the simplest stop of the day. Neither of them expected it to take more than 10 minutes. They walked into the Foxbridge branch of Ridgeline National Bank a little after 11 that morning. Marcus had banked there for almost 13 years, since before Zoe was born, since before Bennett Meridian had a name anyone outside a small circle of investors would recognize. But the woman behind the manager's desk that day, Denise Calloway, had transferred to that branch only 6 weeks earlier. She did not know his history. She had never once pulled up his account. She had no idea that the man standing in front of her in the worn jacket had been a fixture in that building's ledgers for over a decade, long before she had ever set foot inside it. Denise's eyes moved over Marcus the moment he walked through the door, then down to Zoe, then out toward the cracked mirror on the Accord parked at the curb. A man in a pressed gray suit walked in right behind them and was greeted at the counter within seconds. Marcus and Zoe stood waiting while 2 tellers stayed idle, glancing at their manager as if for permission neither of them received. Zoe tugged at her father's sleeve and asked quietly why nobody was helping them yet. Marcus told her that it never paid to assume the worst about people before they had actually done anything to earn it, a rule he had been living by longer than she had been alive. When Marcus finally reached the counter, he placed the check down and asked for it to be deposited into the account he had held for 13 years. The number on the check caught the teller's eye immediately, and within seconds Denise was standing behind the counter, herself, close enough that Zoe took a small step back. Instead of pulling up his account, something any manager could have done, inside of a single minute, Denise began questioning him about where the money had come from. Her voice pitched loud enough to carry across half the lobby. Marcus answered every question without losing his composure. He handed over his driver's license, his debit card, his account number, and the transfer paperwork confirming the sale of his shares. He offered to let Denise call the issuing bank directly, right there at the counter, so she could confirm everything herself inside of 5 minutes. By any reasonable standard, it was more than enough for a transaction that should have taken no time at all. Denise looked at the documents without really looking at them. She told Marcus that a man carrying a $6 million check would not be driving a car like his, or wearing a coat like that one. A young teller named Emily Hart offered to make the verification call herself, but Denise cut her off before she could reach for the phone, ordering her back to her own station in a tone that left no room for discussion. By then, several customers in line had noticed the tension building, and at least 2 of them had already lifted their phones to record. A man near the door said loud enough for Zoe to hear that a man like Marcus was probably using his own kid to make a scam look convincing. Nobody in the lobby spoke up against it. They simply kept their phones raised, waiting to see what would happen next. Zoe's small hand found her father's and gripped it tight, her earlier confidence draining out of her all at once. Marcus kept his voice level and asked Denise one more time to make the call before this went any further than it needed to. His calm only seemed to provoke her further. In front of the tellers, the security guard, and every customer still filming, Denise announced that the check was fraudulent, though she had not verified a single detail of it. Marcus reminded her evenly that she was handling a customer's legitimate assets and should think carefully about what she did next. Denise heard that as a threat instead of the warning it was. She snatched the check off the counter, looked Marcus directly in the eye, and told him that people like him did not walk into her branch with $6 million. Then she tore it in half and then into smaller pieces and let them drift down onto the tile at his feet in full view of his daughter. The lobby went quiet in a way that felt physical, the kind of silence that presses on the ears. Zoe crouched as if to gather the torn pieces, but Marcus stopped her gently, unwilling to let his daughter kneel on a bank floor to collect what someone had just used to humiliate him. He looked at Denise and told her, without raising his voice even a fraction, that she had just made the most expensive mistake of her career. Denise called the police, telling the dispatcher that a man was attempting fraud, threatening staff, and refusing to leave the premises. She then ordered the branch's security guard, a heavyset man in his 50s named Danny Cole, to remove Marcus from the building. Danny hesitated a moment before stepping forward, uncertain why he was being told to escort out a man who had done nothing but stand quietly at a counter. But a direct order from his manager, delivered in front of a full lobby, left him little room to argue. Zoe looked up at her father as Danny approached, her eyes wide with a fear no 8-year-old should have to carry into a bank on an ordinary Tuesday. Marcus tightened his hand around hers and kept his voice low, telling her that everything would be fine as long as she stayed close to him. He understood the position he was in completely. He could resist and risk turning a bad afternoon into something dangerous with his daughter standing beside him, or he could stay calm and wait for the truth to catch up with the moment. He chose the second option, though he refused to walk out the door before someone confirmed what he already knew to be true. He glanced down at the torn pieces of paper scattered across the tile, remnants of a scholarship fund that had not even had the chance to exist yet, and felt something harden in his chest that had nothing to do with anger. It was closer to certainty. If you'd been standing in that lobby watching this unfold, would you have lowered your phone and said something, or would you have kept recording like everyone else did? Danny's grip stayed light on Marcus's arm as they moved toward the glass doors. But Zoe could not stop looking back at the torn pieces still scattered across the floor. She wrapped both arms around her father's waist and pressed her face into his side, begging the guard in a small, cracking voice not to take him away. Danny's jaw tightened, caught between a direct order and the plain evidence sitting right in front of his own eyes. Denise called out from behind the counter, telling one of the tellers to hold Zoe back so the girl couldn't, as she put it, obstruct an officer of the bank from doing his job. That was the first moment Marcus's calm actually cracked. He had absorbed the accusations about the check, the insults about his car and his coat, even the humiliation of watching his own money torn apart in front of strangers. But the instant someone suggested putting a hand on his daughter, his voice changed entirely. He told the teller in a tone that left no room for negotiation that no one was to touch Zoe. Denise seized on that reaction immediately, telling the gathering crowd that his sudden intensity was proof of exactly the aggression she had been warning them about since he first walked through the door. A young teller named Emily spoke up again, the second time she had tried to intervene since the confrontation began. She reminded Denise, as steadily as she could manage, that Marcus had not threatened anyone, and that a single phone call to the issuing bank would settle the entire matter within minutes. Denise turned on her instead, threatening to fire her on the spot if she said another word in front of customers who were still filming every second of it. Emily did not back down entirely, but she stopped talking, aware that losing her job would help no one in that lobby, least of all the man standing beside his frightened daughter. The customers who had been recording kept recording. Nobody lowered a phone to speak up. Nobody stepped between Denise and the family she was quietly taking apart in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday. Zoe looked around the lobby at all the raised phones and lowered eyes and asked her father in a voice just loud enough to carry why nobody would say that he had done nothing wrong. Several people looked away when she said it. Nobody answered her and nobody moved. Marcus felt that silence settle into his chest harder than anything Denise had said, because he understood, watching his daughter's face, that she was learning something about the world that no 8-year-old should have to learn on a Tuesday morning in a bank lobby. At that exact moment, the glass doors swung open, and Walter Hensley walked in, a leather briefcase in one hand and the unhurried posture of a man expecting an uneventful afternoon meeting. Walter was the regional president for the Carolinas division of Ridgeline National Bank, and he had come to the Foxbridge branch specifically to meet Marcus after hours, away from the attention a public meeting downtown might have drawn. The two of them were finalizing a deal worth $680 million between Ridgeline and Bennett Meridian Group, a deal that had been 11 months in the making and was scheduled to close within the week. Walter took 2 steps inside before he understood what he was looking at. Marcus Bennett, the man he had been preparing to meet for the better part of an hour, stood with a security guard's hand near his shoulder, while his daughter clung to his side in tears. Scraps of paper lay scattered across the floor near his feet, and Walter did not need anyone to explain to him what they had once been. His briefcase slipped out of his hand and landed with a heavy thud against the tile. "Mr. Bennett," Walter said, his voice carrying across the lobby with an authority that turned every head at once. Danny released Marcus's arm immediately, stepping back as though the shoulder he had been holding had suddenly become something he had no right to touch. Denise moved toward Walter and began explaining, quickly, that she had just prevented what she believed was a $6 million fraud attempt. Walter looked at her for a long moment before, asking whether she had any idea who the man standing in front of her actually was. Denise opened her mouth to answer, then closed it again, clearly realizing for the first time that the question was not rhetorical. Around the lobby, the customers who had spent the last several minutes recording a supposed criminal lowered their phones just enough to exchange confused glances with each other. In front of everyone still standing there, Walter explained that Marcus Bennett was the founder of Bennett Meridian Group, one of the largest institutional clients the bank currently held, and that Bennett Meridian was in the final stages of a $680 million agreement with Ridgeline National, an agreement Marcus was the only person with the authority to approve or walk away from. The check, he added, was entirely legitimate. The issuing bank had sent confirmation that same morning at 9:52, a confirmation Denise had never once to check before deciding what she believed about the man standing at her counter. Walter then turned to Zoe, lowering himself to her eye level. and apologized to her directly for what had happened inside a bank that carried his division's name over the door. It was a small gesture, but it was the first time since they had walked through those doors that anyone in the building had spoken to Zoe as though her fear mattered, and she looked up at her father as if checking whether it was safe to believe him yet. Denise straightened her blazer and cleared her throat as though composure alone might undo the last few minutes. She recovered quickly, insisting that Marcus bore some blame for the entire incident, that a man carrying $6 million should have dressed the part, or at the very least identified himself the moment he walked through the door. Marcus asked her without raising his voice whether a customer needed to be wealthy before he deserved basic decency. Denise answered that she had only been following procedure, repeating the word twice, as though saying it often enough might make it true. Walter gestured toward the torn paper still scattered on the floor and asked her to name the exact procedure that authorized a branch manager to destroy a customer's legal property in front of his child. "There is no such procedure, Denise," Walter said flatly. "There never has been." While the attention stayed fixed on Marcus and Walter, Denise slipped behind her terminal and tried to delete an internal note she had added to his account only minutes earlier, one describing him as a high-risk customer with a history of threatening behavior. Emily noticed the movement out of the corner of her eye and crossed the lobby before Denise could finish, placing a hand firmly over the keyboard. She told Denise plainly that the note needed to stay exactly where it was, then turned to Walter and informed him that the branch's cameras had recorded the entire incident from 3 separate angles, including the exact moment Denise tore the check apart in front of an 8-year-old. Denise's face went pale at the mention of the cameras, as though she had forgotten entirely that the whole exchange had been filmed by the building itself. Walter terminated Denise on the spot, right there in the lobby, in front of the same customers who had watched her tear the check apart 11 minutes earlier. Denise asked to have the conversation privately in an office instead. Walter refused her outright, telling her she had humiliated a customer in public and would answer for it in front of the same people who had witnessed it happen. Turning to Danny, Walter took a more measured approach, acknowledging that the footage showed he had never used force and had released Marcus the instant Walter spoke. He suspended Danny pending a full review rather than terminating him, giving both of them a chance to look at the footage clearly before anything permanent was decided. Danny's shoulders dropped with something between relief and shame. "I knew something felt wrong the whole time," he admitted quietly, mostly to himself. "I just didn't trust that, feeling enough to say so out loud." The police arrived not long after, responding to the call Denise had placed earlier, describing a black man attempting fraud and threatening staff. 2 officers walked in scanning the lobby, and for a brief moment, Marcus felt the same tightening in his chest he had felt when Danny's hand first landed on his arm, a reflexive, bracing for another round of assumptions, before anyone had asked him a single question. Walter tried to explain that the initial report had been false, but the officers still had to file an incident report, since Denise's original call had already been logged as an official complaint before anyone corrected the record. One of the officers apologized quietly while taking down Marcus's account of events, admitting under his breath that the dispatch call had made the situation sound far more serious than what they were actually seeing in front of them. Several customers who had recorded the confrontation came forward as well, handing over footage that showed exactly what Denise had said and done, from the moment the check hit the counter to the moment it hit the floor in pieces. A woman near the entrance apologized to Marcus directly while they waited, admitting she should have said something the moment the questioning started, instead of only reaching for her phone. A 12-second clip of Denise tearing the check while Zoe watched ended up online before the officers had even finished taking statements inside the branch. By the time Marcus and Zoe finally left the building that evening, the video already had close to 9,000 views, a number that would multiply many times over before the night was through. Within hours, the clip had spread far beyond Millbrook, reaching national attention almost overnight. News vans began appearing outside the Foxbridge branch before the sun had even set. Reporters discovered that Marcus was a single father who had raised his daughter alone for 6 years, and that the $6 million Denise had torn apart was meant, in part, to help launch a scholarship fund for children being raised by single parents just like him. Old photographs of Marcus dropping Zoe off at school surfaced online, alongside interviews from neighbors who described him as a quiet private man who had never once mentioned the size of his company to anyone in Millbrook. Commentators debated the footage for days, and the phrase Denise had used at the counter about people like him not walking in with $6 million was repeated across every major outlet until it was impossible to escape. A few reporters tracked down Denise's previous employment history and uncovered complaints from years earlier that had never made it past an internal file before that week. Ridgeline National's stock began sliding as the video circulated, and the board convened an emergency session that same evening, putting pressure on Hunter to do whatever was necessary to keep Marcus from walking away from the $680 million deal. Walter spent most of that night fielding calls from executives who cared far more about the falling stock price than about the girl who had watched her father accused of fraud in a room full of strangers. He answered every call the same way, telling them the only path forward was full accountability, whether or not it was the answer any of them wanted to hear. More than one executive suggested quietly settling with Marcus before the story grew any larger. Walter refused each time, telling them plainly that Marcus Bennett did not strike him as a man who could be bought into silence. An internal investigation launched in the following days uncovered a pattern far larger than a single afternoon at a single branch. Denise had a documented history of freezing or denying accounts belonging to black customers and lower-income customers, and previous complaints filed against her had been quietly dismissed by branch leadership long before Marcus ever walked through those doors. Investigators found at least 11 prior complaints sitting untouched in old files, each one closed without any real review. A former customer named Harold Whitby, 71 years old, came forward describing how Denise had frozen his pension account for 6 days 2 years earlier over what she called an irregular deposit pattern. A deposit that turned out to be nothing more than his monthly veteran's benefit, arriving on a different date than usual. A woman named Louise Farmer described being asked, in front of a full lobby, to prove that the used car she had just paid off in cash had not been purchased with stolen money. A third witness, a young man named James Doggett, who had briefly worked as a teller under Denise 2 years prior, told investigators he had reported a nearly identical incident involving an elderly black customer and had been told by branch leadership at the time that the complaint would be looked into, and then had watched it disappear into a file that was never reopened until a $6 million check ended up torn on that same lobby floor. Within 48 hours, the police formally closed their case, confirming there had been no fraud and no threat of any kind from Marcus, and noting for the record that Denise's original report had been false from the start. Denise lost her job and now faced the possibility of losing her banking license altogether, along with a civil rights lawsuit and a formal charge for filing a false police report. Lawyers representing several of her past customers began reaching out within days, asking whether they too had grounds to come forward now that her history was finally being examined. Marcus's phone did not stop ringing that first night, filled with messages from reporters, lawyers, and even distant acquaintances who had never once called him before, but suddenly wanted to know if the rumors were true. He let almost every call go to voicemail, choosing instead to sit with Zoe and let the noise outside their small house stay exactly where it belonged. On the other side of a door, he had no plans to open that evening. But the sharpest moment of that whole night did not come from the board, the lawyers, or the reporters calling for comment. It came from Zoe, later that evening, sitting across from her father at their kitchen table, picking at a dinner neither of them had much appetite for. She looked up at him and asked whether anyone would have apologized at all if they hadn't found out he was rich. Marcus set down his fork and looked at his daughter for a long moment, searching for an answer that would not feel like a lie. He had no answer for her. He had been cleared because he happened to hold a kind of power most people never would, and he understood, sitting there with her question hanging in the air, that thousands of people walked into banks just like that one every single day without a regional president arriving in time to call them sir. The lawyers arrived at Marcus's house 3 days later, dressed in suits that looked out of place against the modest porch and the cracked Accord parked in the driveway. They came with an offer already prepared, one that included a financial settlement, a public apology from the bank, and the termination of several employees, all in exchange for one condition. Marcus would sign the $680 million agreement as planned and say nothing further about what had happened inside the Foxbridge branch. Marcus listened to the entire proposal without interrupting, aware that a single signature could still cost Ridgeline National hundreds of millions of dollars and end more than one career at the top of the company. Part of him wanted to walk away entirely, to take Zoe somewhere far from cameras and never set foot inside another Ridgeline branch again. But he kept thinking about her question from 3 nights earlier, the one that had followed him into every quiet moment since. If nobody had known he was rich, would anyone have apologized at all? He understood that punishing Denise and pressuring the bank into a public statement would satisfy his own anger, but it would do nothing for the next person who walked into a bank without a regional president standing nearby to vouch for them. He told the lawyers he would keep the deal on the table, but he refused the personal settlement outright, telling them he had no interest in being paid to stay quiet. Instead, he laid out a list of conditions that had nothing to do with his own bank account, and everything to do with what happened the next time someone, without his last name, walked through those doors. Every branch would undergo an independent audit for discriminatory conduct, conducted by outside investigators rather than the bank's own compliance office. Any decision to freeze or deny a customer's account would require approval from a second manager before it could take effect. Customers would have the explicit right to request independent verification whenever a dispute arose. Employees who reported wrongdoing would be protected from retaliation, a condition Marcus insisted on directly because of what he had watched happen to Emily in that lobby. Frontline staff, including security personnel like Danny, would receive training on when and how to question an order that was clearly wrong instead of following it simply because it came from someone above them. Security footage and transaction records could no longer be deleted once a complaint had been filed against an employee. Customer rights would be posted publicly inside every branch, in plain language, where anyone waiting in line could read them. And finally, Ridgeline National would fund a permanent financial assistance program for single-parent families, seeded with the same money that had once been torn apart on a lobby floor. The board resisted at first, arguing that some of the conditions went far beyond what any single incident required. But with the deal and the company's reputation both hanging in the balance, they had little room left to negotiate. Within the week, every condition had been accepted and written into the final agreement, alongside a public timeline for when each change would take effect across every branch in the region. Denise's banking license was permanently revoked, and she now faced a civil rights lawsuit alongside the charge for filing a false police report. Employees who had helped bury previous complaints against her were placed under formal review as well, closing out a pattern of silence that had protected her for years longer than it should have. Danny was reinstated once the investigation confirmed what the footage had already shown, that he had never used force against Marcus and had let go the instant he was told to. He was placed into the very training program Marcus had insisted on, learning alongside other staff how to recognize and refuse an order that crossed a clear line. When he saw Marcus again weeks later, he apologized quietly, admitting he wished he had trusted his own instincts sooner. Marcus told him there was nothing left to apologize for. Emily was kept on and promoted to assistant branch manager, a new role that put her in charge of rolling out the staff training program across the region, all because she had been the only person in that lobby willing to speak up while everyone else stayed silent. The bank issued a replacement check once the original had been formally voided, and Marcus split the money exactly as he had always planned. Half went into the trust, securing Zoe's future. The other half became the seed money for what he named the Zoe Bennett Fund for Working Parents, a program built to support the children of mothers and fathers raising kids on their own, the way he once had. Marcus insisted that the very first round of scholarships be administered out of the Foxbridge branch itself, the same building that had once refused to believe he belonged there. 3 months later, Marcus and Zoe walked back through those same glass doors. He still drove the same cracked Accord and wore the same navy jacket, unwilling to change anything about himself simply because the world had briefly decided his appearance mattered more than it should have. Zoe held his hand the same way she had that first afternoon, though there was nothing tense in her grip this time, only the easy comfort of a kid walking beside her father on an ordinary errand. The bank looked different in ways that went beyond fresh paint or new signage. An employee greeted them the moment they stepped inside, asking how Shy could help before either of them had said a word. Nobody's eyes lingered on his coat or his keys before deciding how he should be treated. For the first time since that first visit, Zoe did not ask why nobody was helping them yet. A new placard stood near the entrance listing every customer's rights in plain language, along with a number for an independent complaint line that had nothing to do with the branch itself. Emily came over to greet them in her new role, mentioning that the first round of staff training had already rolled out across the entire region, and that early feedback from other branches had been better than anyone expected. Danny stood near the door in his uniform, and when he caught sight of Marcus, he offered a small, genuine nod, a far cry from the tense hesitation Marcus remembered from 3 months earlier. None of the customers who had once stood filming with their phones raised ever came back to that branch again, and Marcus noticed absence without needing to say anything about it. At one counter, a young mother was opening her son's first savings account, met with none of the suspicion Marcus and Zoe had faced that same afternoon 3 months earlier. Nobody questioned whether she belonged there. Zoe watched the scene for a long moment before turning to her father and asking if that was the reason he hadn't simply walked away from the bank entirely after everything that happened. Marcus thought about it before answering, choosing his words carefully, because he wanted her to actually understand them rather than just hear them. Closing a door is easy, he told her, making it open for everyone is harder. Zoe nodded slowly, the way she did when she was turning an idea over in her mind instead of simply accepting it. Before they left, Marcus let her hand the very first scholarship letter to a young student being raised by a single father, and he watched his daughter's face as she understood, maybe for the first time, that $6 million had never been what made him matter. What mattered was that he had the power to seek revenge and chose, instead, to make sure the next person through those doors would be treated like they belonged there from the start. Father and daughter walked out together, finally continuing the plans that had been interrupted 3 months earlier, a stop at the bookstore, then dinner at the diner near the old train depot. If you had been standing in that lobby the day it all began, would you have stayed silent behind a raised phone, or would you have been the first one to stand up for a father and his daughter? A person should never need $6 million to be treated with basic respect. Marcus didn't win the day Walter Hensley recognized him as a powerful investor standing in his own branch. The real victory only arrived once he used that power to make sure the next person walking through those doors would be treated fairly, no matter who they were, what they wore, or how much money they were carrying with them. If this story moved you, subscribe for more, and carry that same lesson with you the next time you're standing in a room where someone else is being underestimated. Diglaner, this story is a work of fiction created for entertainment and educational purposes only. All characters, names, businesses, and events depicted are entirely fictional and do not represent any real person, living or dead, or any actual establishment. Any resemblance to real persons, organizations, or events is purely coincidental. This content is intended to explore themes of human dignity, workplace ethics, and social justice through narrative storytelling. It does not make factual claims about any individual company or institution.